sole survivor of a wagon train massacre. A cowboy found her and gave her a home. The smell hit me before I saw anything. You don't forget it. Wood smoke gone cold, and underneath that, something else, something the buzzards had already found. My horse, Decker, stiffened his neck and blew hard through his nose, and I gave him a minute because he'd earned the right to be uneasy. It was mid-morning, maybe 10 o'clock, the sun still climbing and the light still sharp and flat the way it gets in late September when the heat hasn't built yet. We were 3 days south of the Cimarron crossing. Nothing out here but grass and sky, and the old Santa Fe track worn into the earth. I came up over a low rise and saw them. 6 wagons, or what was left of 6 wagons. 2 of them had burned down to the iron, the hoops still standing like ribs on something gutted, the canvas long gone. The others had been turned over, broken apart, contents scattered across maybe 200 yards of ground. Flour sacks split open, the white powder already brown in the dirt. A rocking chair on its side with one runner busted off. A Bible, pages loose and turning in a little finger of wind. Cookware everywhere. Somebody's good dress, pale blue, hanging from a creosote bush like it had been put there on purpose. I sat Decker and I looked at it for a while. I was 49 years old. I'd been pushing cattle up and down this country since I was 17, and I had seen things. I don't need to list them. The point is I didn't spook easy, and I didn't ride away easy either. You don't just ride away from something like that. I rode down slow. There were 11 of them that I found. 11 people. A family group looked like men, women, 2 children. I won't say more about it than that. I found a good flat place and I got to work, and it took me the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. My back hurt by the end. I'm not 25 anymore. I was walking Decker out to the edge of the scatter, looking for anything that might tell me where these folks were headed or where they'd come from, when I heard it. Not much, just a sound, like something shifting its weight. One of the wagons that hadn't burned had been dragged off the track and down into a dry wash. I don't know why, maybe they pulled it for cover or maybe it rolled. The tongue was broken and the whole thing listed hard to the left, almost tipped over. I walked down to it, crouched and looked underneath. Nothing there but shadow and cracked clay. Then I went around to the back. She was in the wagon bed under a false bottom, a storage space maybe 14 inches deep, built right into the floor. She'd pulled a piece of oilcloth over herself and packed loose grain sacks around the edges, and she was lying absolutely still when I lifted the hatch cover, so still I thought for a moment she was gone. Then her eyes opened. Brown eyes, dry. Whatever crying there had been was long finished. I said, "Don't be afraid of me." She said nothing. I said, "I'm alone. I've got water." She looked at me for a long time. Then she moved to get up and couldn't do it on her own, and I reached down and took her by the forearms and lifted her out. She weighed nothing. Her dress was dark with old blood along the left side, hers or someone else's. I didn't know yet. She stood on her own 2 feet in the gravel of the wash, but she kept one hand on the wagon sideboards. I got my canteen, and I handed it to her and stepped back so she had room. She drank. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 34 years old. She was traveling with her brother's family, her brother Caleb, his wife, their 2 children, and 3 other families they'd joined up with in Dodge City. She told me this in pieces over the next 2 hours, sitting in the shade of the one standing wagon with the oilcloth rigged as an awning. She told it the way a person tells something they've already told themselves 100 times in the dark, flat and measured, pausing in places that weren't natural pauses, the way your mind skips over the parts it can't hold. She'd hidden under the floor because Caleb told her to. He'd heard something at dawn before light, and he'd woken her and told her to get in the storage space and not to come out until he came for her himself. She'd heard everything. She'd been in there for, she thought, 2 days. She wasn't certain. I told her what I'd found and what I'd done about it. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "Thank you." That was all. She didn't cry. She just folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the grass, and I sat there with her because that seemed like the thing to do. I had a decision to make, and I made it without any real deliberation. I was heading back north. I'd finished a cattle run, and I was riding back to an outfit I worked out of near Caldwell, Kansas. There was a town called Harker's Mill about 40 miles northeast, big enough to have a doctor and a telegraph office and a boarding house. I would take her there. I said as much. She said, "Where after that?" I said I didn't know. That was her business. She nodded, she looked down at her hands, and she said, I have no money, everything was in the wagon. I said that wasn't her problem to solve right now. She looked at me then in a way I didn't quite know how to read. Not grateful exactly, more like she was measuring something. I rigged a bedroll behind my saddle and she rode behind me on Decker, and we made camp that night by a creek I knew was reliable. I had enough provisions for a few days if we didn't overdo it. I got a fire going and made coffee and cooked the last of some salt pork I had. She ate carefully, not fast, which told me she had some presence of mind even now. She slept by the fire. I sat up most of the night, not because I expected trouble, I didn't, or not especially, but because I don't sleep well in open country anyway, and because it seemed right to keep watch. 49 years old and I'm still doing things because they seem right. My father would have called that stupidity. My mother would have called it character. I called it just how it was. At some point near morning, she woke and found me still sitting there, and she said, "You haven't slept." I said I'd sleep when we reached Harker's Mill. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the fire for a bit. Then she said, "What's your name?" I told her Cal Dunmore. She said it back once quiet like she was filing it away. It took us 3 days to reach Harker's Mill. 3 days of riding and 2 more nights in open country, and I will say this, she never once made it difficult. She didn't complain. She was in pain, her left side, where the blood had dried, turned out to be a deep gash along her ribs from something. She didn't know what, maybe the floorboards when the wagon was moved. It had closed up on its own and mostly healed, but it was ugly. She never mentioned it until I asked directly. She asked me about myself on the second day, riding, the plains unrolling in every direction and not a soul in sight. I'm not a man who talks much about himself, but she asked plain questions and seemed to want plain answers, so I gave them to her. I'd worked cattle most of my life. I'd been married once, young, and my wife had died of a fever before we'd had much time together. I had no children. I owned nothing except Decker and my gear and a little money put by in a bank in Caldwell. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Do you like your life?" Nobody had ever asked me that. I thought about it genuinely and then said I didn't think like or dislike entered into it much. It was just my life. I knew how to do it. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "That's honest at least." I think that was the first moment I understood that she was not like most people. She had a quality I recognized because I had something like it in myself. She said what she meant. No decoration, no easing into things, just the thing itself. We rode into Harker's Mill on a Wednesday afternoon. The doctor was a man named Elias Prout, 50 or so, spectacles, careful hands. He looked at Nora's side and cleaned it properly and said it was healing, but she needed to rest it, no hard riding, no heavy lifting, 2 weeks minimum. He said she was lucky it hadn't gone septic. Lucky was a word I thought about. I got her a room at the boarding house, Mrs. Holt's place, clean, 2 meals a day included. I paid for 2 weeks because that's what the doctor said she needed, and because I didn't know what else she had or what she was going to do. She objected. I told her the objection was noted. She looked at me with that measuring look again. Then she said, "You don't even know me." I said I knew enough. I said rest and come find me in 2 weeks if she needed anything else. I took a room at the Holt place too, because I had no particular reason to rush back north. The job at the Caldwell outfit wasn't holding a chair for me. I worked seasonal, and there wouldn't be another drive until spring. I told myself it was just convenient. I might have believed it. The truth of it is this. I had carried people before. Strays, hurt things, folks who'd come apart at the seams one way or another in this country, which was not a forgiving country and had never pretended to be. I'd helped a few of them and moved on without a second thought. This was different, and I knew it was different, and I didn't examine it very hard. She came down to breakfast every morning and we ate at the same table. Mrs. Holt served good food, real eggs, biscuits, gravy that had actual thought put into it. Nora ate well after the first couple of days. The color came back into her face. There was a general store in Harker's Mill, and on the 4th day I went and bought her a dress. Figured what I figured about her size and hoped for the best. Dark green, nothing fancy. She was sitting on the boarding house porch when I came back and I handed her the package without much ceremony, and she looked at it and then looked at me. She said, "Cal." I said, "The one you had was ruined." She opened the package there on the porch. She held the dress up and looked at it carefully. Then she said, "It's the right size." I said I'd had some practice guessing. She smiled. It was the first one I'd seen, and it changed her face. She wasn't a soft woman, you could see that, but the smile was warm, real, no performance to it. She went inside and came back wearing the dress and sat back down in the chair, and we didn't make anything more of it. There was a man in Harker's Mill named Creed. I don't know his first name, nobody used it. He ran a feed and supply operation out of a warehouse at the south end of town, and he had 4 or 5 men who worked for him, though worked was a generous way of putting it. He dealt in land speculation mostly, I was told, and in a few other things the town tolerated because it was easier than not tolerating them. He noticed Nora within about 3 days of us arriving. I noticed him noticing. He was the kind of man who moves on a woman the way he moves on everything. Slow, certain, sure of his welcome because his welcome had never seriously been refused. He came to the boarding house on the 5th evening, knocked, asked to speak to her. Mrs. Holt came and got me instead, which told me something about how clearly she read the situation. I went to the door. He looked me over and said he'd come to call on the woman, not me. I said she wasn't receiving visitors. He said he'd take her word on that. I said she'd already given me her word to pass along, and he was looking at it. He stood there a moment with something working behind his eyes. Then he smiled, very measured, and said that was fine and left. I went back inside. Nora was at the top of the stairs, she'd heard. She came down and stood in the hall. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said I didn't do anything he wouldn't have done to a man he thought was in the way. She said, "Are you in the way?" I looked at her. I said I supposed that depended on what he was in the way of. She held my gaze and didn't look away. Then she turned and went upstairs, and I stood in that hall for a while before I went to bed. Creed came back, not to the boarding house, he was smarter than that. He started appearing places Nora went. The dry goods store, the post office where she'd sent a letter to an aunt in Missouri. He was never aggressive, never obvious, just there, constant like whether you can't do anything about. On the 9th day, he stopped her on the boardwalk outside the general store with 2 of his men flanking him at a polite distance and spoke to her for several minutes. I wasn't there. She told me about it at supper. She said he'd offered her a position, working in his warehouse doing his books. He'd heard she was educated. He said he'd pay well and see to her comfort. I put down my fork. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I was already employed." I looked at her, she looked back calm. She said, "I assumed you wouldn't mind me borrowing the idea." I said I didn't mind at all. Then I said, "Are you actually looking for work?" She said of course she was. She couldn't live on charity. I said what I'd spent on her so far wasn't charity. It was. And then I stopped because I didn't have a word for it that didn't sound wrong one way or another. She waited. I said, "I've got land, 160 acres northwest of Caldwell. Proved up homestead, I filed on it 3 years ago, but I haven't done much with it. Got a house on it, built it myself, but nobody's lived in it. I've been working cattle runs and leaving it sit." She was very still. I said, "If you want to come north with me when your 2 weeks are up, you could stay there while you get your footing. It's not charity. You could keep house if you wanted something to do with your hands, or not. That's up to you. There's a town 6 miles away, Arden has a school. I was told once they needed a teacher. I don't know if that's still true." She looked at me across the table. The lamp between us put half her face in shadow. She said, "Why?" I said I didn't know exactly. Then I said, "You've got nobody right now. Everybody needs somebody sometime. And you're not the kind of person who makes things hard. I'd rather have a person around who doesn't make things hard than spend another winter alone with that empty house." It was the most I'd said at one stretch in years. She looked down at her plate. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet just barely. She didn't let it go further than that. She said, "All right, Cal." We left Harker's Mill on a Thursday. Creed was at the south end of Main Street when we rode through, and he watched us go. I met his eyes as I passed. He looked away first. That was enough. The ride to Caldwell took 4 days. We bought a second horse from a man outside of town. A solid gray mare, nothing flashy, good legs. And I used most of what was left in my pocket to do it, which left me thin. But Nora sitting her own saddle made the kind of sense that dollars don't always account for. She was a decent rider. Better than I'd expected, though I don't know why I'd expected anything. She sat a horse like she sat everything, steady, upright, no waste in her. We talked more on that ride than I think I had talked to any person in 5 years. She told me about growing up in Ohio, her father's farm, the way Lake Erie looked in November. About Caleb, who'd been funny, who'd made her laugh even when their father was drunk and difficult. About why she'd come west with them, partly because she had nothing holding her in Ohio, and partly because she was 34 and a woman alone in Ohio wasn't much of anything, and she'd thought maybe the West would be different. I asked if she thought it was. She considered it. Then she said the West was harder, but it was more honest. In Ohio, she said, everything was polite and nothing was fair. Out here, at least you knew where you stood. I said I'd always thought that was right. She said, I think I knew you'd say that. On the third night, we made camp by a small spring I'd used before, cottonwoods around it, and good grass for the horses. The nights were getting cold. It was October now, the stars sharp and closed the way they get when the cold has cleared everything out of the air. We sat by the fire after supper and didn't talk for a while. That was comfortable. Silence with most people isn't comfortable. It was with her. After a while she said, "What was your wife like?" I was quiet for a bit, then I said, "Good, she was a good person, didn't get enough time to be much else as it turned out." She said, "Did you love her?" I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "I never married. I was close once. He decided I was too much of something, I never found out exactly what." I said that was his loss. She turned to look at me across the fire. She said, "You say that like you mean it." I said I did mean it. She held that a moment. Then she turned back to the fire and pulled her coat a little tighter and said, "Good night, Cal," and rolled into her bedroll, and I sat with the fire a while longer before I did the same. The homestead was north and west of Caldwell, down a long rutted track off the main road that was rough in summer and worse in winter and genuinely bad in the mud season. 160 acres of mixed grass and scrub and a draw with some timber in it. The house was small, 2 rooms, stone on the lower half, lumber above, a good solid chimney I'd built with help from a Mennonite neighbor named Hebert who knew masonry. The roof had held. There was a well. There was a small barn, half-built, with 3 decent stalls. I'd left it expecting nothing would be there when I came back, and I was right. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, which was to say it needed work. She walked through the house. I stood in the door and let her look. She said, "You built this yourself." I said mostly. Hebert had helped with the chimney, and a couple of neighbors had come for the roof raising. She ran her hand along the stone of the fireplace. She looked at the 2 windows, one in each room. She looked at the floor, which was board, not dirt. She looked at the ceiling, which was low but solid. She said, "It's a good house, Cal." I said it needed a lot of work. She said, "I know, I can see that." I said, "It's a good house." I looked at her standing in the middle of that room, the green dress, her dark hair, the morning light coming in through the west window. The house had been empty for close to a year. It didn't feel empty anymore. We spent the first week just putting things right. I had an account at the general store in Arden, and I drew on it for what we needed: wood for the stove, flour, salt, some tools she needed for the kitchen, a second lamp. She worked hard, not performing it, not trying to prove anything, just worked, the way a person works when they're used to working and know how to pace themselves. She could cook. She was a better cook than I was by a considerable distance. The neighbor who'd mattered most to know was Walt Hebert, the Mennonite big quiet man, a few years older than me, farmed 2 miles north. He came by on the second day with his wife, Edna, and a basket of things: a cured ham, dried apples, a jar of honey. They were direct, plain people, and they looked at the situation the way plain people look at things, clearly, without flinching, and without asking questions that weren't their business. Edna said to Nora, "You'll need company this winter. Come to us when you want it." Nora thanked her. I saw something pass across her face when she said it, not quite relief, but something close. She went to Arden about the school. Turned out they did still need a teacher. The previous one had left in August, gone back east, and they'd been making do. The school board met with her on a Friday morning, 4 men around a table in the back room of the grain elevator, and they asked her questions about her education and what she could teach. She was a composed woman, but I could see the set of her shoulders before she went in. I waited outside. She came out 40 minutes later. She said, "They want me to start Monday." I said I figured they would. She looked up at me. She said, "How did you know about the school?" I said somebody had mentioned it. She said somebody in Harker's Mill. I said maybe. I might have asked around a little before we left. She was still for a moment. Then she shook her head slowly, not annoyed, more like she was turning something over and finding it different than she'd expected. She said, "You do things quietly." I said I didn't see any reason to make noise about it. She said, "No, I don't suppose you do." The trouble came in November. I'd been back at the homestead maybe 3 weeks when a man showed up at the door one evening, dusk, a cold wind off the north. He'd ridden hard, his horse was wet and blowing. He said his name was Tom Vesser, and he said he'd heard there was a woman here, a survivor of the Wagon train attack in September. He said he'd ridden 2 days to find her. He said he was Nora's cousin, come to take her back to Ohio. Nora was inside. She'd heard the voice. She came to the door. She and Vesser looked at each other for a moment. I watched her face. Then she said, "Tom." He said, "Thank God. Nora, thank God. Come with me. Your aunt's been out of her mind with worry. We'll get you home." She stood in the door. She said, "I am home." Vesser looked at me, then at her. He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "I'm teaching in Arden. I have a position. I have a place to live. I'm not going back to Ohio." He was a decent-looking man, Vesser, mid-40s, lean, road dusty. Not a bad man, I thought. He looked at me. He said, "Are you her husband?" Nora answered before I could. She said, "Not yet." I looked at her. She looked back at me, steady and level, not a trace of apology or uncertainty in her face. Vesser cleared his throat. He said, "I see." I put his horse up for the night, and he stayed in the barn, and in the morning I fed him breakfast, and he was polite about everything. Before he left, he took me aside by the barn door and said, "She had a hard time of it coming up." I said I knew. He said, she's not a soft woman. She never was." I said I knew that, too. He looked at me a while, then he said, "You'd better be what she thinks you are." I said I'd do my best to be. He nodded once, swung up, rode out. I watched him go. Nora was on the porch when I came back to the house. She was wrapping her hands around a coffee cup and looking north toward the Hebert place, where you could just see the smoke from their chimney against the gray sky. I stopped at the bottom of the porch step. I said, "Not yet." She looked at me. Her expression was that measuring look, but softer, something underneath it that she wasn't bothering to hide. She said, "I meant it, Cal." I said, "I know you meant it. I want to be sure you know what you're saying." She said, "I've known what I was saying since Harker's Mill." I said, "The boarding house." She said, "The door, when you went to the door and told Creed to go home." She paused. "A man who does that without any fanfare, without needing me to see it done or thank him for it, just did what needed doing and went back inside." She turned back toward the Hebert chimney for a moment, then back to me. "That's a man I can build a life with." I stood there with the cold coming off the north and the smell of her coffee in the air, and I thought about 32 years of this country, everything it had taken and everything I'd made of what was left, and I put my foot on the bottom step and then the top step, and she held out her hand. I took it. Her hand was warm. She'd had both of them wrapped around the cup, and they were warm. She held on, and I held on, and we stood like that looking north toward where the Hebert smoke lifted straight up into the gray November sky, neither of us saying anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. We married in December, first Saturday after the ground froze. Preacher Gill came out from Arden, and the Heberts came, and 3 other families from the county came, because Edna Hebert had spread the word in her quiet way, and people came because they wanted to, and not because they were told to. There was no grand thing about it. Preacher Gill read the words, we said the words, Edna cried a little, Walt shook my hand hard enough to remind me he'd once pulled a stump out of frozen ground with nothing but a chain and a mule. The women had brought food, and we ate in the house around the stove. The school had let Nora out for the afternoon. She stood beside me in the house that I had built, and she wore a dress that Edna had helped her with, dark blue wool, good for winter. She had a small spray of dried flowers that someone had kept from summer. I don't know whose idea that was. She was the most composed person at her own wedding. I was probably the second most. At some point in the afternoon, she was talking to Edna by the window, and she glanced back at me across the room, just quickly, checking where I was. When she found me looking at her, she didn't look away. She smiled, that same real smile from the boarding house porch, nothing performed about it, and then she went back to her conversation. I felt it then, the full weight of it, what this was, what it meant. I had spent 32 years being useful to various people in various ways, and I had never particularly expected anything in return, and I had made my peace with that, or I'd thought I had. And then here was this woman who had been through the worst thing a person goes through, and had come out the other side still standing, still plain-spoken, still measuring things clearly, and she had measured me and found something worth staying for. I was never going to be a young man again. I was never going to be a rich man. I knew that. The ranch would be what we made it, and that was going to take years and hard winters and things going wrong and us fixing them. There was no neat version of any of it. But she knew all of that, and she was still standing here. That's the thing about a good woman who chooses you with her eyes open. It's not that she doesn't see your flaws. It's that she sees past them to the part of you that's actually worth something, and she decides that's the part she's going to stand next to. There is no better thing in the world than that. It's been 11 years. We proved up the homestead properly, ran it up to 240 acres, bought 80 from a man named Poole who needed to sell in a hurry and wasn't going to get a better offer anywhere else. Got the barn finished the second summer. Got cattle on the grass by the third year, a small herd, nothing like what I'd spent my life driving but mine. Ours. Nora taught school for 6 years until we had enough and she chose to stop. By then people knew her in 3 counties. She wasn't a soft woman, the way Vesser had said, and she didn't try to be. She was fair and she was direct, and she remembered everything, and she was the kind of woman that other women came to when things went wrong, because she wouldn't flinch, and she wouldn't waste your time telling you things were fine when they weren't. She saved my life twice. Once with a poultice and a knife, and 2 days of sitting up with me when a fence wire went through my hand, and it swelled wrong. Once in the winter of the 3rd year when I came in from a blizzard blind and half frozen, and she stripped me down in front of the stove and got me back from somewhere I don't like to think about. I never said much about either one. She didn't require that I did. This morning she was up before me. She's always up before me now. It took about 2 years before she felt safe enough to sleep later than I did. And by the 3rd year she'd given that up completely and was just early because she's early. I came into the kitchen and she was at the stove and the coffee was made and she looked up when I came in, the way she always does, just to note where I am in the room. And I put my hand on her shoulder as I passed. Just a touch. Not even a full stop. Just the habit of 11 years. And she reached up and put her hand over mine for a moment before I moved on. I'm 60 years old. My back is not what it was. There are things I can't do now that I used to do without thinking, and there are things I'll never do again. That's just the arithmetic of years. But I've got 240 acres of good Kansas ground and cattle on it, and a barn that's solid and a house that's warm. And there's a woman inside it who looked at me across a boarding house table with a lamp between us and decided I was worth her time. I think about that wagon train sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. I think about what it cost her. I think about 11 people under the ground south of the Cimarron crossing and what it means that she's here and they're not, and I don't have a way to make sense of that, and I've stopped trying to. What I know is this: she came through it, and I was there when she came through. And I didn't know enough to see what I was doing at the time. I just did what seemed like the thing to do, one step after another, the way you do things in this country when you haven't got a plan, and it turned into my life. The best life I ever had. She came through it and she chose this, and I get to be what she chose. You tell me a better deal than that, I'll wait.